set your seat in its upright position and buckle up because you're about to experience the funniest Bible study in the history of the universe.
Greg Perry, the most interesting author in the world, unleashes rib-splitting insight from the most important book ever written. While Perry is the masculine theologian, he's also joyful, gleeful, playful, grateful, whimsical, and always biblical. Here, you get the Super Bowl of Bible study, the Stradivarius of podcasts, and the Armageddon of truth. And while you're laughing, he may just scare you off the path to hell. And here's the man you are waiting for. Well, it's his podcast after all. Greg Perry.
Yeah, the Trainride of Truth tracking toward you. I am your ever-loving host, Greg Perry, with Dexter. He's my sound guy. We're back with another Gregcast broadcast, reminding you that every episode broadcasts in a 100% completely judgment-free zone. We ask that you honor our request for a judgment-free zone by never charging money to judge others. And we promise that we will never charge you or anyone else when we judge and rebuke. Judgment-free, rebuke-free, all the time. We've been doing some research here at the funniest Bible study in the history of the universe. We've been working on the Beatitudes in the Gospels. Those are such wonderful verses. But we've been doing some personal Bible study on our own through the Beatitudes, and while they've been wonderful, really, I've moved past them now. I think you'll understand. I know the Beatitudes so well that I consider myself more than ready now for the C and D attitudes. So I don't want to talk about myself. I hate talking about myself, you know that. I thought I'd read to you about myself. That's not the same thing, right? It's from this podcast's book of the week entitled, "The Public Schools Aren't Broken. Destroying Children and America is What They Were Designed to Do." It's a book that just lost about half my audience from its title because so many Christian parents prefer to ship their children off to the weapons of mass instruction known as the public schools to let the government train them for 12 years or more. For one thing, it was good enough for those parents, so it's good enough for their most precious gifts on earth. Oh, also it's a free daycare for 12 years. I don't mean it's really free, but all of the neighbors around them have to contribute, under force of law, their property taxes to pay for those children's 12 years of government training. It's a great system if you don't like what God said about raising your own children. So that book is aimed at such a wide reading audience that I needed to explain who I was in that book in the About the Author section. I've been getting questions from people who know nothing about, but who have started listening to the podcast wanting to know my background and who am I and what am I doing here. So I thought I would answer who am I and what am I doing here by reading this About the Author section out of my book. I don't normally like just reading to you, but it's interesting. The book that I wrote about the public schools, Weapons of Mass Instruction, are read by many who don't know my background and my other writings, so I included an intro about myself there that I think will apply here. Let me warn you, when I write against a wicked system such as the government schools, I don't pull any punches. And along those same lines, some who don't know me would think my intro is quite pompous. Unlike most other times in their lives, if they're liberals especially, they happen to be correct. My bio in that book actually is fairly pompous, but as always, it's #GoodToBeMe. So going forth, those who know nothing about me will get a glimpse here. A skewed glimpse, but nonetheless, it's all the truth. So without further any-whos, here's a short bio that I'll read to you, but perhaps toss in a few commentary tidbits along the way. Greg Perry is known as the most interesting author in the world. Perry is a bestseller and the Merchant of Truth. In the 1990s, he was considered the most prolific author of computer-related writings on Earth, and more than 85 of his books about computers were published, many of which are still in print, by major publishers all over the world, and translated into almost every language in the world. Those books, published by traditional publishers, are now counting up toward the 4 million books sold mark, having already surpassed 3 million in sales. His technology-related magazine and journal articles were legion. Note, Perry's, that's me, Perry's written more books, published by international authors than most public school teachers have ever read. Since the 1990s, he began his own publishing company named Make Right Publishing Incorporated and has since been publishing his own titles as well as for other authors, specializing primarily in diet and health-related titles, but also including far more than those as well. Make Right Publishing Incorporated has had best-selling titles, many of which were ghostwritten by Greg Perry, that's me, on Amazon's best-selling lists, often with 2 or more ranking above best-selling titles such as The 4-Hour Body, just a few short months after Tim Ferriss's release of his book. In other words, somebody listens to me, a lot of somebodies. Maybe you should too. This book, and for those of you listening, remember this is my About the Author section of the book on the public schools. This book is about the government school system, the school system designed by the government and for the government. This book isn't about technology or health. Still, would you rather read a highly read and one of the most prolific writers of the last 25 years, or read somebody who has no credentials to communicate truths to you? Perry, this is a new section. Perry, that's me. Perry exposes the left in what is considered the right. Perry's writings are considered some of the most hardcore right-wing you will ever find. Not the angry, aggressive right-wing that the left defines, but a true right. The God-fearing and biblically correct knowledgeable right. What Hollywood portrays as conservative, Perry mocks as being leftist. If you think the GOP is conservative, for example, your eyes will be opened after reading some of his writings, such as Disabling America, The Unintended Consequences of the Government's Protection of the Handicapped. We expose the left in what is considered the right. Bring back fire and brimstone preaching. You know all those preachers in movies and TV shows that preach fire and brimstone? Those kinds of preachers don't actually exist today. That's a shame. There's nobody willing to discuss sin and consequences of sin. Hollywood's mockery has done its job. Preachers prefer to avoid criticism instead of being godly. Today's lukewarm churches teach that saving souls is possible without warning souls. This isn't the way it's done in the Bible. For those of you listening, see, this is a Bible study. This book exposes the truth about the massive theft and destruction known as the public schools. To many selfish parents, all government-trained teachers, and the horrid school administrators, by the way, only the best teachers become principals and administrators, which means the worst. The school system is a religion, so in that sense, this is actually a religious book. But keep in mind, Greg Perry, that's me, Greg Perry despises what most churches teach, lukewarm pablum. And by most, we mean 99.99%, with a lot more nines after that final 9. But don't accuse us of generalization because we're not talking about all churches, just 99.99999%. Why listen to Greg Perry? For those of you listening to Greg Perry, that's me. That's a new section title, by the way. Why listen to Greg Perry? Not only is Greg Perry the proved historic king of technology writing, he's traveled the nation teaching international seminars, such as the acclaimed Freedom Fest. In addition, here's a small sample of his national media appearances. He commanded his own segment on C-SPAN, telling the nation eye-opening information they never ever heard before, changing minds and hearts about the evils of ungodly government intrusion. He helped compose and then starred in a Penn and Teller Showtime special episode in which he was featured as the go-to man for the topic's expert opinion. John Stossel requested his presence in a special anniversary John Stossel episode on the Fox News Network. John Stossel, a godless libertarian, sorry to be redundant, was skilled at editing Perry's words and arguments, sometimes to portray them as his own in the final edited broadcast. In 5 years of co-writing, producing, and often co-hosting a nationally syndicated talk show on national television broadcast over satellite in the 1990s and on many networks, one that aired 5 nights a week, Perry was the only person trusted and allowed to guest host when the host was out of town. Perry has been a featured writer and columnist for many websites including LouRockwell.com, the now extinct Proper Villains, and the acclaimed WorldNetDaily.com. Greg Perry, that's me, prefers to expose the lies of the so-called right over the left. After all, the left is expected to lie and be wrong most of the time. In this effort, he has attended seminary, taught many in-depth Bible studies, and is one of the most extraordinary writers about the Bible, one who can expose the fallacies of most lukewarm believers today. If you're not a Christian, though, you'll love seeing him attack the sad state of the church today in his writings. Be on the lookout for his upcoming tome. It's not in the Bible. If most Christians believe it, it's probably untrue. A culmination of his life's work, available soon. Note to my podcast audience, it'll be available when I'm done with it. Greg Perry, that's me, is a business maven. Although that's not where his interests fall, he provides tons of advice in his writings and appearances for improving yourself and your income. After receiving an undergraduate in computer science, he received his MBA, Master's in Business Administration, with an emphasis on corporate finance. Greg Perry has traveled the nation, taking weapons training classes all at the best academies in the nation, therefore the best ones on earth, including the acclaimed Gunsight Academy founded by Colonel Jeff Cooper. Several of Perry's books and other writings center around weapons and self-defense. Perry and his wife Janie have traveled the globe, spending a total time away of several literal years outside the USA, learning about other cultures and seeing what works and what does not. A person who writes about right and wrong has little gravitas behind him if he's not well traveled, from the bubbling hot springs and ice-capped mountains of New Zealand to an exploration of the inside of Egypt's largest tombs, to studying how the best coffee on earth is made in Venice, to getting sick in the smog-infested provinces of China. By the way, if you have enemies, tell them China's a great place to visit. To being kidnapped in Singapore. That's a true story, but fortunately, not as bad of a true story as it sounds. Greg Perry has traveled the world and has years of experiences in personal growth and observations to share along the way. With Perry, you get all stuff and no fluff. The number of weak, uninteresting, soy-consuming, estrogen-laden males are growing in both real numbers as well as in percentages of males today. The real man is on his way out, often laying down his proper dominance to a feminist-run society. Whether you're a man or woman, you owe it to yourself to learn from such a world-traveled man of letters as Greg Perry is. To ignore such an individual is to ignore growth you would otherwise enjoy. So, that's it. What'd y'all think? Hey, what do we do now in the short time that's remaining, Dexter? Do you have any... He's my sound guy. We don't have a lot of time to cover a topic, and we can't even really start one properly. And if you wonder what in the world I've said so far that has to do with the Bible, well, perhaps you didn't listen to the previous podcast number 5. You should go back and listen to that if you didn't, and you'll see that everything I've said here has to do with Bible study, even though we didn't mention one book, one chapter, or one verse number. Oh, there is a thing I want to mention. If you did, or if you do go back to podcast 5 from last week, I was discussing my funeral and how I didn't care what anyone does with my body. I want a cheapo funeral-o. That's Mexican for low cost. But I did want to say one thing about graveyards. I think we Christians do the unsaved a disservice these days. I think we design our churches all wrong these days. We design them the way the government wants. And I just don't think that's right. Used to, and you'll see these in old westerns and old movies, you'll see a lot of times they would have churches, little country churches especially, and right outside the windows there would be a graveyard, and that's where all the people from the church, were buried. I like that about churches. I think it encourages its members to get saved. And the reason why is every single Sunday morning and Wednesday night, or whatever the schedule is for that church, everyone, they're sitting there in the pews listening to the pastor, and they all look out the window and see a bunch of gravestones. I just think that's great. I think that's a good reminder of where we are all headed. We are all going to escape life and fall into death one of these days. For many, it will be sooner than later. And I think having those headstones right outside the church window when that pastor's preaching is a grave reminder of their destiny, of every single one's destiny. And what we do now is we don't build graveyards next to churches anymore. And we put cemeteries way out somewhere else, far from churches, and they have their own place far from anything that has to do with God. And many cemeteries now, of course, are multicultural, which means anti-God. Multicultural is a code word for anti-God. Now, there actually is one church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's one of the largest United Methodist churches in the region. You've heard me talk about it before. You heard me talk about the heathen, the minister over that church last week in last week's podcast number 5. And what he told me as he and I were walking along the sidewalks of Oxford University in England is just astounding. It surprises many. It doesn't surprise me because he's a United Methodist minister, but it surprises a lot of people. Now, what is interesting about that building, it has a letter T on top of it, and it's a building, the United Methodist building. It has a cemetery in its courtyard for members, but not for all members who pass away without cost. And I don't think it's bad for a church who has a cemetery, if there are any left that have real ones, to charge the cost of the burial plot and all of that to the family of the member who dies. That's fair. Or the church can just use its own donations and tithes. That's fine to do it for, quote, free, but there is a cost associated. But the thing about this cemetery next to this building is that, first of all, not everyone can be buried there. You have to be very special. And also it costs tons of money. You have to be a huge contributor to the church, and you have to be a huge contributor after you die to pay for one of these plots. Now, for other people, for the normal people going to that building, you're required to hold your service in a small chapel next door. You can only hold they can only hold a burial service for family members in the big, what they incorrectly call the sanctuary. They can only hold funeral services there for, the higher ups in the church and the big donators and the, I believe, some higher up employees of the church, primarily the minister and the staff right under him, I believe, and some high-ranking staff from the past. But it's very rare that they allow funerals of their own people in the real sanctuary. Anyway, I know I'm sounding like a nattering nabob of negativity about this place, but I want to remind everyone that the gauntlet was first tossed down by them when the minister told me at Oxford University a few years ago that he didn't believe in a literal hell. I made the mistake once, many years ago, of attending this building with my parents, who my mom is still a member, I'm sad to say, but that's a different story. I opened up the hymnal to look through it because the minister was talking about some magazine article. He hadn't really, actually, I don't think he had mentioned the Bible yet in that service. And I was just bored, of course. Sorry that I was there. And I opened up the hymnal, and it opened up to the following, quote, hymn. The Native American Great Spirit Hymn. Did you get that? The Native American Great Spirit Hymn. So it's not even really a hymnal. It's some feminist hermenal. I mean, that's basically all it is. The Native American Great Spirit. I mean, it certainly isn't great. It is a spirit, but it's a fallen spirit. But maybe a year or two ago, and so I was never going back to this building, of course, no matter what. But my mom, she's 84 and she's having some troubles, but she is in the choir there, and she had this choir thing a couple of years ago, so I went. I didn't want to, but you do things for your mom. And he opened up his service with a quote from Woody Allen. Now, it wasn't a Woody Allen quote that was, portraying of Woody Allen being the vile pervert that he is. No, he was talking about how he follows Woody Allen's advice. And I believe that the quote was 90% of success is just showing up, something like that. Who cares? Woody Allen said it, so who cares? And so this minister of the largest United Methodist Church in the region, he quoted Woody Allen like the guy was a saint. Why? I don't know, with 31,000 verses in the Bible, maybe he could have found one from God to quote, but he decided to quote Woody Allen. I don't know if you remember, but Woody Allen is the guy who married his daughter. Remember that? He divorced his wife and married his legal daughter. Now, it was actually their adopted daughter, but he married his daughter. That's this filthy pervert. But I'm off on a track again, aren't I? You see, this is the problem. That United Methodist building there is really not, it's not unique. It's one of the many. That's 99.99% of churches these days. They only talk about things that can distract people from the reality of heaven and hell. So next week we'll return to a more traditional podcast. I do understand that people need to know more about me, so that's a little background to explain. As we wrap, I do want to thank Dexter. He's my sound guy. We want you to keep in mind that someday we'll be going on eternity leave. Now, when I do, you won't have me to kick around anymore, Buster. But you'll be going on eternity leave too, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. But until you do, you have full control of the thermostat when you arrive. You can either order excruciatingly hot or perfect. Where you spend your eternity leave is your choice. I could quote Putty and say, "I'm not the one going to hell, but I'd love to see you elsewhere." And let me remind you that stop, drop, and roll doesn't work in hell.
You've just been attacked with a force field of truth. Remember, if you're ever unsatisfied with anything we say, you may mail back the unused portion and we'll gladly say identical or similar material at no additional charge in the future. Please allow 6 to 8 weeks for processing.